Hello, I am Donna Warren at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I am delighted to welcome you to the second talk in the ALACT speaker series. ALACT stands for Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, and we are delighted to have you with us. We are especially delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Aidan Kestigian, who is Vice President for Operations and Curriculum at ThinkerAnalytix, and also an associate with the Philosophy Department at Harvard. Have I gotten all of that right, Aidan?
Spot on, Donna.
Excellent. Well, I will turn it over to Aidan, and I would just like to say, if anyone has questions for Aidan, I will be monitoring the chat, and also she will be devoting some time at the end of the talk for questions. So take it away, Dr. Kestigian.
Oh, thank you so much. So I do have some slides. Let me get those up. All right. Looks like screen sharing is working. Everyone able to see a blue screen? Perfect. First of all, thank you to ALACT for this opportunity. I'm so excited to be here. So many friendly and inspiring faces here today. What I'm hoping to talk about today, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, about the organization I work for, and want to share some kind of experimental work that we're doing right now around the topic of intellectual empathy and intellectual kind of understanding. So a part of this talk will focus on kind of like a problem I see from the perspective of an educator, and then talk about some of the work we're trying to do to kind of address the problem and fix it at scale. So just to start off, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about who this funny little group is that I work with and for. So I work at a nonprofit organization called ThinkerAnalytix. We started as an outreach program spun out of the philosophy department at Harvard. So I am not currently like a full-time faculty member or anything like that, but my background is in teaching philosophy at the college level. And what we do, we build resources for faculty and students from grades roughly 9 up through graduate school. So you can think like types of curriculum, things for people to use in the classroom. But we also work with professional development. And so trying to provide resources for critical thinking in the professional space. And it's been a real, what's really cool about my job is that we get to spend a lot of time thinking about the preparation that students need for success in college level courses. And in this kind of transition from secondary to higher ed, and we largely operate in the US context, but we do have an international reach at this point. And in general, our mission, our goal is to help prepare people, not just students, but also, like I said, professionals, to have better, more productive disagreements by building reasoning skills in particular. So that's kind of who we are, what we do on a day-to-day basis. And so what I'm hoping, if folks would be willing to just drop in the chat, I think it would be nice, especially for discussion later, if you want to share something about sort of what brought you here today, what you teach, if you teach or taught, or what your research is, I think that could be interesting just to kind of have a sense of who's in the room. So if folks are willing to drop that in the chat as we get going, great, but no pressure. All right. So like I said, I'm hoping to kind of pitch to you a problem, and in particular, a problem from the kind of teaching and learning space. That's kind of where I spend most of my time. So this will be sort of from the perspective of an education context. I'm going to give you sort of a general statement of the problem and then talk about some of the contributing factors. So I want to talk a bit about the problem's origins, defining terms and some issues defining the scope of the problem. And then I want to talk a bit about some of the experimental work we're doing to try to help, to try to make some improvements. And then, as Donna mentioned, I'd love to leave time for questions and maybe thoughts, next steps. So I'm hoping to leave at least kind of 15 minutes at the end for chat. And as questions come up, please do drop them in the chat. Like, we're a small enough group, I think we can just kind of chat about those as we go. And thank you, Donna, for keeping an eye on it, just in case I don't see the little pop-up. All right, so the problem that I sort of pitched in the abstract for this talk, oh, that was strange, sorry. There we go. Is that many students, and I say our students with the Royal Hour, lack the skills to read, discuss, analyze, and evaluate arguments using what philosophers would call intellectual charity. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. But the question that we're facing right now at ThinkerAnalytix is, how can we instill these skills of charitable interpretation in a way that is scalable, so can reach many people in many places, especially in a way that's sort of technologically enabled, and in a way that's sort of systematic, right? So I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that as well, but those are sort of the two kind of principles driving a lot of our work. Okay, so first, let's talk about sort of the origins of this very general problem. Here's a statement I hear a lot when I go out and visit faculty at different institutions. I used to be able to assume that my students had the sort of basic critical thinking skills needed for my courses. So like when they walk in the door, they kind of come with some basic critical thinking skills. And one thing we're hearing now is that there's this perception that COVID changed that completely, that COVID has sort of undermined those skills, caused a kind of latency in the development of those skills. Given like that critical thinking is sort of in the name of this organization that we're meeting as today, I probably don't need to tell you it wasn't just COVID, right, that contributed to this problem. For a long time, right, students haven't necessarily had the opportunity to develop these skills. And so I just want to say, like, I acknowledge that COVID has made this kind of problem more poignant, I think, for people, but it certainly isn't like the only origin sort of source of this problem. I think part of the problem is actually that the skills of charity aren't taught explicitly. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So in the US, it's the case that most secondary educators aren't trained to teach charity or just teach reasoning skills in an explicit way. It's just not part of their kind of professional development. It's also the case that, and I don't need to tell you all that, you know, we don't often have great models of intellectual charity, right? Being able to discuss and debate in a way that's sort of balanced and reasoned. You know, just think of like Thanksgiving tables, right? It doesn't always go according to plan. Often, and this is what we've heard from working with thousands of students, is that college students learn how to be charitable by watching professors be charitable, but don't often get explicit and sustained practice in the skills. And something that someone said to me recently that really stuck with me is this idea that professors use the word charitable in a way that feels really theoretical, but students have a hard time kind of grasping what is meant, right, by that term in terms of kind of practical in-class engagement. Like, what is it to be charitable? What is it to be not charitable? How can I kind of differentiate when I'm playing by the rules and when I'm not? So it just feels kind of out of reach to really be a tool that can be applied. Okay. It's also the case that getting to a place where we can practice charity, especially around issues that are really compelling, but also really controversial, can feel really risky. And there's a couple ways I've seen this recently. So as a starting point, the word argument, this object of logic, of philosophy, just the word itself is fraught. often students don't actually know what we mean by argument. We have to just start basically from square one and define that what we're talking about isn't like a bickering match or a fight, right? What we really want to talk about is claims and inferences and the moves that people make in their reasoning. Another issue is that I don't think this is specific to any one educational context. I've heard this at the secondary level and at the higher level, that just opening oneself up as an educator to classroom debate, so making space to have conversations about arguments that require really precise and careful thinking, can feel scary. Like it feels like you're taking a real risk in the classroom. One educator told me recently, what they want is like a suit of armor. They want a method or a tool that they can turn to when students ask about things like, pick your favorite controversial issue, maybe one that's happening, as early as this week. They want something to fall back on and really have as like their backup, like their support. So that's one thing. I think it's also the case, and we're seeing this more and more in our work, that moving from low stakes practice arguments, so kind of like fodder for like logic puzzles, kind of pick your favorite arguments about like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Does pineapple belong on pizza? Moving from something like that to a high stakes real world argument. Many of the educators we work with feel like that move requires quite substantive planning and coordination. So they don't want to just kind of like drop controversial issues in a classroom without having talked about really how to do that well with colleagues and maybe even with administrators. And I think there's a reason for that, and that's because they want to provide a consistent and supportive environment for students. They want to make sure that students aren't getting kind of whiplash in one class, and it's very different from what they're seeing in other places on campus. So that again is like, that just adds a level of planning and of work ahead of time. And also, legitimacy is on the line. So when we go in to do trainings now with faculty, I just got back. I was telling Donna before this, I just got back from a trip talking with faculty. Trainings around how to have conversations around controversial issues are super heavily designed and vetted. So I'll often go 10 rounds back and forth on revising slides for a talk for faculty on how to have conversations around controversial issues using reasoning skills. That's not uncommon. Like, that's like, people want to know ahead of time what they're going to get and what it'll look like, and especially for a large group. And finally, another issue is just that time and other resources are limited, right? We all have limited time to really plan these materials for students, and that's just a crunch. But there are opportunities. So in particular, of course, I'm sure many people on this call feel this way, right? There is a strong desire to prepare students to have these conversations around controversial issues. And that even though, acknowledging, academic freedom, and that everyone has kind of their own approach to teaching critical thinking and reasoning around complex arguments, having some sort of unified set or guidelines can be really helpful, even if it's just a jumping off point, right? So I'm going to propose some kind of experimental materials we've been working on, not to say that it's the end all be all of the conversation. I'm not trying to pitch you the solution, but that coming together to try to have some guidelines that we can put in front of students and be adapted to their context can be really helpful. And it's something that we can actually collaborate with students on, and that like how these conversations should go. This is an interesting point for me. Something I've really had hit home recently is that faculty cohesion can make a huge difference, and it really matters. So we've seen in places where people are able to have discussions and debates around controversial issues and really take them and really handle them with intellectual charity. It's often places where faculty from different disciplines have come together to design frameworks for that to happen, which is just something interesting. Like I taught for a while just in philosophy. Like I didn't think about going to folks in other disciplines to try to think about how to have productive conversations. I wish I had. We're doing that work now. But I think part of the reason is just that repetition and shared language across disciplines can give students ownership of these kind of key frameworks and concepts that they need. And so if they hear in, say, a history course, that, if they hear the word argument and they know, okay, these are kind of my key steps for how we're going to engage arguments on, say, controversial historical issues. If they know that when they go to a philosophy course and that we mean kind of the same thing, and that they can kind of refer to the same set of key steps, that's powerful, right? And it shows that really critical thinking exists in all of these disciplines, right? It's not just kind of relegated to critical thinking courses or something like that. So there's a lot of power in that. Okay. So now I'd like to get into some of the kind of like the content of this problem. So what I just talked about was sort of like some of the origins, why students, I think, have trouble engaging charity from a kind of origin perspective. But let's just talk about like the concept itself. So intellectual charity, I think in the abstract, I said something like, it's this idea that you need to not jump to conclusions about other people's arguments. You need to read them carefully. You need to ask questions. There's sort of all these things, and I'll give you a list in a second about all the things we might mean by it. But when students just hear the word charity, they often find it very confusing. And I think this image is part of the reason why. So this I screenshotted yesterday from Google. This is just, if you type in the word charity, what comes up? Of course, it's things like an organization, providing money, volunteering, right? And so unless we stop and sort of say what this term really means, they often think of charity as like you're doing a favor or something. You're doing something for someone as a benevolent act. And I guess you could see charitable interpretation that way, but often I don't think that there's that tight of a connection when we're practicing it in courses. So I just wanted to pose that this is a problem, and it's actually something that's led us to try to drop the word altogether, just because it causes so much confusion. I think another thing that causes confusion is that if you try to enumerate the things we want students to do to show intellectual charity, it's a pretty long list. It's a diffuse kind of list. And often we just don't do this kind of list for students necessarily in class. So for example, listening carefully and asking for clarification. That's usually part of how we charitably interpret arguments that we hear and read. Probing for someone's underlying reasons or values. Even just like noticing that a statement needs to be interpreted or better understood than how it was originally stated. Interpreting statements in a way that makes the most sense in context and is like plausible, right? Not attributing false claims to someone even when you disagree. Identifying hidden assumptions, that can be part of charitable interpretation. Also just checking your interpretation, right? Like asking questions, being able to formulate questions that help you get at a deeper understanding of the view kind of on the table. And again, like not attributing mistakes. So either false claims or maybe sort of weak inferences to an author. Okay, so I just wanted to pose this list mainly just to say, I think that this note of this hearing from a student that charity feels really theoretical, I take really seriously. And I think part of the problem is just that there's no one source, right, that tells us what charity, how it ought to be defined, and what the component skills are. And so I think that does students a disservice, and that we just like the actual definition of the term really matters for their ability to grasp it. Another dimension of this problem, and one that students can find confusing, is just knowing which arguments we should handle with charity. Like, what are the arguments that are in bounds and what are the ones that are out of bounds? So yeah, like on a theoretical level, what are the moral boundaries around which arguments should be like permitted and kind of live and open for discussion, and which are the ones we don't include, right? But then there's like the more practical question of like, okay, if it's really possible to, as a person in a classroom with 20 people live, sort of, what do you do when these things come up? Maybe a student voices a view that you think is abhorrent, right? Like, what do you do in that case if it is outside the bounds? Like, is it possible to really to navigate that in a way that's constructive, right, for student learning? So I'm not saying I'm going to answer these questions. That's like a lifetime's worth of work. I just wanted to pose that I think part of the trouble here is the scope issue, about which things really should be like the fodder that we're using for teaching, and what to do when things that maybe even at a campus level we think should not be permitted do come up. All right. Again, scary. Can be scary for people. Okay. So in terms of, so I just listed for you like a bunch of problems. A bunch of issues that sort of are live. What I'm hoping to do now is shift to some experimental work that we've been trying and working on with educators at all different levels. So our process for building curriculum and building workshops and things like that is iterative. So often what we will do is interview faculty who are experts in these areas, many of whom are on this call, work on to produce some resources, and then actually put them in classrooms and try them and see how they work and get feedback from faculty and from students, and then iterate. And so we work a little bit like a startup in that way. We try to iterate a lot and get a lot of feedback on the materials that we produce. So what I'm putting out to you today is really like the thing that we're experimenting with now. So that I don't want to give you the idea that all of this is like set in stone. In fact, I'm hoping to hear from you all what you think about the things that I'm about to kind of put in front of you, and how you would work on this with students or with colleagues. So I'm hoping to actually look at those three kind of subsets of the problem. So the terms, the scope, and the origins. And yeah, just kind of see what you all have to say. As I said, this is very experimental. We're trialing this actually right now. So here's one thing we've heard from working with educators. It's just some general, so this question about scope, right? When should we be charitable? What arguments are sort of worthy of charitable interpretation? And just trying to develop some very basic kind of maybe jumping off point kind of thoughts and guidelines for students to think about. So this is what I'm about to show you is sort of it's almost like crowdsourced from faculty material on what they say and how they would pitch this to students. So one of the categories of arguments that maybe don't deserve charitable interpretation are those that have like very high stakes. So ones you might include are things like genocide denialism, the myth of the lost cause, the pro-Putin perspective. Sorry, I don't know why it's like bumping in different places at different times. So these are things where educators say like the stakes are so high, it's really just not productive to include these arguments and try to take them and interpret them charitably. Another area, or the other end of the spectrum, is the ones that have like no stakes, that are completely non-consequential. You might think that these are, it's like just not worth the time. So I mentioned some of these before, right? Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is water wet? Questions that are just kind of silly and maybe are just hard to handle with the kind of seriousness that intellectual charity raises. And then the final area, and this is, I don't pretend to be an expert on this, but I just wanted to raise this as things that we've heard recently in many different contexts as types of arguments that might be something we should consider. So and those are ones that are identity related. So topics that we've actually been asked not to raise in different in educational contexts with our materials are things like affirmative action, transgender athletes and inclusion in competition, and questions around immigration. So again, like I'm raising these as samples. These are things to kind of think about as frameworks. So in particular, right, I'm not saying these are the end all be all, but these are just things to consider as a framework that we could put to students and say, hey, we're going to, have conversations, but here are some ideas about the ones that we think we're not going to debate, the ones we're not going to discuss and treat with intellectual charity. All right. In general, though, examples are great. General guidelines can be more useful. So things we've heard from faculty, helping students think about the emotional bandwidth that's required to engage in argument, thinking about your time, thinking about just like your capacity and how much of that capacity you will expend by engaging this argument. You want to kind of take care of yourself and want to make sure that you're in a good position to engage arguments charitably. Also, considering your interlocutor, this is something that's I think I'm still thinking a lot about, right? Like knowing when to engage based on the person that's posing the argument to you. So you might think something like, if the person that you're engaging with isn't engaging in good faith, you might want to kind of step aside and kind of just stop the conversation there. Maybe something like a 2-strike rule. Also, the likelihood of having a positive impact, right? If you're engaging in an argument that you think is really detrimental, but there's literally no possibility of maybe not even persuading the other person, but just better informing them on a topic or something like that, you might think like it's really just not worth the effort. So again, just giving you kind of thoughts for general guidelines that we could workshop and use with students. All right. Another thing that's sort of interesting, and Dona's name is up here because Dona's a collaborator on this project too. So there's some joint work we're doing with the Visual Thinking Lab at Northwestern, just about like what productive conversations and in particular productive argumentation looks like. And so I'm not putting these up here as the end all be all, but just this idea that maybe we could start to stipulate norms, right? Norms for students to think about as they enter classrooms where argumentation is kind of the center point. These are just examples, right, having to do with motivation and clarity and the quality of arguments put forward. And again, the point just being that having some clear kind of guidelines at the ready can be helpful because it shows students kind of like the rules of the game, right? It gives them a sense of expectations, like what is it that we're hoping to get out of the conversation, right? And also, how should I engage it behaviorally? What should I be doing when I'm offering, say, my point of view? Some of these norms actually dictate what that ought to look like. Okay. So all that stuff I just showed you, super experimental, super like early days. We're trying to do more on that because we're hearing a lot of demand from faculty on those topics. But the thing that we're kind of more along the road on is actually defining these key terms and building opportunities for explicit practice for students. So that's where I'm hoping to spend the last chunk of my time here. So thinking about even just the terms we use. So for example, just starting from square one, what is an argument, right? Argument is the object, right? It's the thing that we're applying these charitable interpretation skills to. And these definitions we've workshopped a lot with faculty from all different areas, all different kind of levels, secondary, higher ed. And they sound so simple. They're to a higher ed audience, they probably almost sound too simple. But what's interesting is that we've found that for students to, it's really important that students know that the word argument they hear in one discipline is the same as it is in other places. Or if it's not the same, why it's not the same, right? Why the object is actually different. So part of the work we're trying to do is just make sure that students have an operating definition that can cut across different disciplines. Okay. Now, the meat of this talk and the meat of kind of the title of the systematizing intellectual empathy. So working on charity and trying to help students build charitable interpretation skills, we found that it was hard for students to build those skills. And so what we wanted to do was find to build some resources that met some criteria. And these are the criteria. So we wanted to define a protocol or a set of steps that students could follow and actually practice explicitly. So literally like a checklist of behaviors or things that they could do in a conversation when they weren't sure what to do. They weren't sure how to interpret, or they kind of found themselves lost in an argument in, say, a class discussion. We wanted this protocol to focus on argument specifically. That's just our bread and butter is argument. And so it has a sort of intellectual or academic kind of tinge to it, right? Because those are just the contexts in which we're working with students and their instructors. And we also wanted to define a goal. We think it's really important that students know the purpose of practicing these skills. And so at a minimum, what we were hoping was to give them a protocol that would help them gain a really precise understanding of someone else's argument, even if they could do nothing else with it. Just having that minimal kind of goal of understanding was our purpose. Also, maybe seemingly less important, but I think also really important, is finding a name for this protocol that students could grasp and really feel ownership of. And we wanted to build a resource where students could practice these skills in a scalable way. So wanted to be able to reach a lot of students with sort of minimal kind of time and effort needed from faculty. So where we landed, which was really kind of surprising to me, but has kind of landed better with the audiences we work with, is this concept of empathy. So empathy is centered on understanding. And in particular, we're not thinking about empathy in terms of kind of feeling the way someone else feels. Instead, we're focused on empathy as a kind of understanding someone else's point of view. And that's why we call it intellectual empathy, as opposed to just kind of empathy writ large. So the protocol that we're working on is called systematic empathy, or you could call it systematic intellectual empathy. And it has several steps. So these are steps that we've workshopped with faculty over the last couple of years to try to give students really clear steps to follow. So the first is to identify your own assumptions about the topic. So when you engage in argument, first maybe take a moment and just think about the assumptions that you have that you're bringing to the conversation. The second is to, listen to or read the argument in question, the one that you're focused on, and identify its context, which I will admit has been the toughest skill to teach so far, and I'll give you some reasons why. The third is to identify claims in the argument that require translation into your own words. So maybe they're vague or overstated or confusing, right? Claims that really, they're the ones that require the interpretive kind of step. Fourth is to repeat the argument's claims, or we call it translate, into your own words. Also very, very hard to do. I'll give you some examples. And then if the speaker is available, right, check your version of your claims for accuracy. This can feel a little robotic, but literally repeating someone's argument back to them live, and then asking questions and trying to refine your translation over time. So again, this is a prototype, right? It's a prototype of a protocol for students to follow so that when they're engaging an argument, especially one that they're kind of predisposed to disagree with, they can kind of follow the steps and at least come to some translation of the argument in their own words that they understand. Okay, open questions are like what the other steps should be. Like, what would you want students to do after they've got this understanding? I think this is a sort of like DIY, select your own adventure kind of situation for educators, right? What are the next things we want students to do? What are the next moves? But I'm just going to leave it at step 6 for today. Super interesting things we've experienced over the last year to 2 years of building this protocol. Context is super important and it's really hard to teach. So we actually posed to students who seem to have these skills, kind of, these interpretation skills already, like, how would you explain context to another student? Like, how would you describe that? And here's what they wrote, or here's what a student wrote, I should say. Context or scope is an important part of every argument. And they said you should think about the limit of an argument. What are the sort of bounds that the author is, or the speaker is stipulating? Who, what, where is the author talking about? Like, what are the things that they're talking about? And finally, how would you describe the people, places, or topics that the speaker is focused on? What's interesting is that, context is important because it stops you from jumping to conclusions about what an author thinks or might think. But actually explicitly stopping and asking questions about the context, we found has been really important, not just for students, but also when we're training faculty, which is kind of interesting. So for example, here's one where I think the context, an example of kind of jumping to conclusions. So strict translation, just trying to put someone else's claims in your own words, is super hard. It is, and it's shockingly hard. So here's an example. Here's an example where we asked actually a faculty member to translate a claim from an argument and what was output. So here's the original text. It's a quote by Greta Thunberg. People aren't continuing like this and not doing anything because they're evil or because they don't want to. We're destroying the biosphere because we're selfish. We're doing it simply because we're unaware. And so we asked, we were doing some work, and we asked a faculty member to just do a strict translation of this claim. And this is what they wrote. The biggest threat to the destruction of the planet is widespread ignorance about the consequences of our actions. So what's interesting about this is that it does actually go a little bit beyond what's included in the original text. So, Greta Thunberg is a famous climate activist, right? So we know that they think that this is a very important topic, but they don't actually say that it's the biggest threat, right? The biggest part is imported. And so I think this was a really interesting moment for me, because I realized, just like when we're asking students to be charitable and keep really close, do a really close reading, it's just not a skill that even like this person is taught for like 25, 30 years, incredibly skilled educator. Not even, it's just a very high bar to set to ask someone to do that. And so I just wanted to show this as an example of like just how deliberate and small the practice can be to expose some of these, the lack of these skills. All right. So the question is, how do we go about this translation? What kind of guidelines can we give students about how to translate? We've workshopped, this could still use a lot of work, but this is the sort of guidelines that we've kind of developed over the last couple of years. So we often tell students to restate claims in a way that makes them true, or at least plausible. So don't attribute false claims to the argument's author, and make sense in context, right? So again, this context issue comes up both in reading the text, but also in interpreting it and trying to put it into your own words. So that's the kind of guidelines that we tend to give students. And we do this practice through low stakes and high stakes arguments. So we try to move from lower stakes up to higher stakes. So I'll give you a practice exercise, and I'd love to have you all answer this. So here's an argument. And the question is, how would someone practicing systematic empathy translate the word literally in this argument? So here's the argument. Jenna's birthday party was literally the best event ever. She had live entertainment, delicious food, and an awesome guest list. It was such a pleasure to attend her special day. So here's some options. Does literally mean throughout history, there's never been a party better than Jenna's? Is it that Jenna's party was awarded the honor, the prize of best party? C, the speaker will never attend a party better than Jenna's birthday party, or that Jenna's party was one of the best events the speaker has attended. So, okay, this one's pretty easy, right? You would think. Not all students get this right? Some of them will pick something like C. C is maybe a little bit more reasonable than like A, right? A is kind of obviously false. But right, just attending to the limits of the argument, right? And what the author, what is plausible, takes that practice. So anyway, we try to start with these kind of funny arguments that are very low stakes, before moving on to higher stakes arguments. So here's an argument. And the question is, how would you translate the claim that Catholics don't want contraception to be accessible? So the US is a country based on freedom and the right to pursue one's own beliefs, religious or not. Therefore, it's just that the Supreme Court ruled that employers and universities are allowed to refuse employees or students contraceptive coverage due to religious or moral opposition. For example, Catholics don't want contraception to be accessible. And I'll give you some options. I see something in the chat. Let me see. Yeah, great. So which one's the right answer? All right, we've got to vote for C. I'm curious if anyone would be willing to explain why some of the other answers don't work. Because that's often where kind of the learning is happening. So for example, what's wrong with option A? Again, it's sort of a limits question, right? Like what is the argument truly about, right? In this case, it's really it's focused on contraception. And option D is B and D are also both focused on contraception, but it's too weak, right? Like the option D doesn't give kind of enough to the argument to help the author have made sort of reasonable or moderately strong inferences, right? So D is like true, but not enough, right, for this particular argument. So it's this balancing act, right? And helping students think through like, what are the mental moves that they're making when they're picking some of these different options? Okay, let me speed forward in the interest of time. So we talked about scope, we talked about terms. What's the real goal of this argument? Yeah, Mark, I'd love to hear more about that. We're almost at the Q&A, but I would love to hear more about that question in just a second. So, right, of course, in a dream world, right, we could wave a magic wand and students would just have these skills when we see them, when they come to our classrooms. And so there are some changes happening to kind of make that the case. Obviously, it would be great if students just learned how to do these things in elementary school, middle school, right? They got their start early. But we don't have control over that. And so what's interesting, we're starting to see some new models break out in the higher ed space. Things like outreach programs, orientation programs focused on skill, like academic skills, not just like how to not drink to excess, right? Like things that actually focus on the academic side. Also things like asynchronous pre-college and first-year learning, right? Trying to get these skills in a sort of widespread, cross-disciplinary way. And it's just been really cool to see just the innovation happening outside of standard course structures, which are obviously the time and energy are limited there, right? So in terms of the actual content, right, thinking about this word argument, it would be really cool if on campuses we saw some collaboration across disciplines to define this term for first year students especially, and try to generate a general kind of practical set of guidelines for engaging arguments that moves beyond just like general statements from administrators that that students get emailed to them about like productive engagement. I think really just like practical sets of skills, even if they're just a starting point, right? Even if there's something we want to workshop with students, having a starting place can be really helpful. Explicating why we argue. What do you get out of it? There are many students who don't want to argue at all. There's the ones who want to argue too much, and there's some that want to argue not at all. But what's the purpose? And even if these explanations are incomplete, right, they can give us some handle on expectations and for their college career. And then one thing I just wanted to leave you with, something we've been trying recently and actually just did in a couple of workshops with faculty, is the use of scripts as a way of having classroom discussions around arguments. So often, at least in my education, what I experienced was the way you learn to be charitable is by engaging arguments yourself kind of live, by having classroom conversations about them and kind of stating your own views. That can feel, as we mentioned earlier, kind of high risk. But we found that using scripts can be a really kind of fun way for students to engage arguments, because they're not having to state their own views, in this case, for example, on genetic engineering, right? So I pitched this script to a group and just said, what makes this disagreement productive? What makes it unproductive? And we had a really fruitful conversation, but without the temperature kind of going through the roof, right? People were able to pick out things they liked, they didn't like. And that led to a conversation about norms and what makes for productive disagreements more generally, but without having to have a kind of bad disagreement ourselves, if that makes sense. So this is just like kind of a new thing we're trying to make space for talking about these things without diving right into the tough conversations. So I just wanted to pitch that. That's kind of like a cool thing we've been trying and having some success with. And now I apologize for going a little bit over time, but would love to hear questions, comments. I know there was a question in the chat. We could maybe start there, but yeah, thank you all so much. Donna, should I do you want me to just call on folks?
You can do it if you want, otherwise I can do it. But
Okay.
I see Kent has a question.
Yeah, and I can stop my screen share so we can all see each other. Hi, Kent.
Hi, Aidan. Thanks, but I would love to defer to the question in the chat, which preceded my hand being up. So why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, Mark, is Mark here? Oh yeah, sorry, Mark.
Yeah.
I couldn't see you on the screen. Would you maybe just be able to explain a little bit your question?
I don't have it in front of me now, but it didn't seem, first of all, it wasn't exactly clear, A, that it was an argument, and B, it certainly wasn't clear that it was an argument for Catholics or against contraception. So that's why I raised the question. Now, if I was going to interpret that, I'd have to have it in front of me, but I certainly would interpret it as having the conclusion Catholics are in favor of contraception, especially since, of course, they said it's just an example of something or other. And so, B, while I have the floor, sorry to abuse it slightly, I've often struggled with this term charity for all the reasons that you pointed out. And so I've suggested fair-mindedness, which doesn't have this kind of emotional kindness thing, as perhaps a more appropriate concept. So I just drop that out.
Super interesting. Yeah, fair-minded. We've heard even-minded is sometimes. I'm wondering if other folks have other terms that they've used. I love it. Yeah, absolutely. Empathy does come with baggage, I'll say, like it has the emotional side of things tied to it. But we also picked it because it does have quite a lot of recognition right now, and it just seemed to land better and sort of give people a picture better. But it's almost like branding, right? Like, how do we brand these skills to students? I love the fair-minded approach. Yeah, very cool. Oh, and as for the question about the translation, yeah, in that case, I think we weren't asking what the conclusion or the ultimate claim of the argument was. It was more, there was like one sentence in particular to translate.
Right.
But maybe we could have done the translation better, for sure.
Well, if the goal is to get students to translate arguments as opposed to sentences, we want arguments for them to translate, or things that are proto-arguments, which is maybe what we were just looking at there.
Yeah, so it's a very short paragraph argument, right? Where and by argument, all I mean is reasons plus.
By the way, you must know Monty Python's famous argument clinic.
Yeah,
I use that. When I taught, I used that day one to deal with the problem. What is an argument?
Love it. Yeah. Humor is so important. Wait, I can't tell you the number of times we've had that sent to us.
I'm sure.
We have another question in the chat. So do you want to take the in-person question, Aidan, and then we can do the question in the chat?
Perfect.
We have like 5 minutes.
Yeah, Kent, I think you were next. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So it seems that I'm in a Zoom room full of philosophers, and I'm not a philosopher, a longtime middle school teacher. And
awesome.
But I have a basic question. I'm so intrigued by this, by going back to the when not to be charitable, and I can see that is a thorny one.
Yeah.
Full of minefields. And it makes me ask if you could say, what is the point of being charitable? So the reason that we engage in charity is what?
Interesting. Yeah. I'll give you my pitch, the one that we've kind of landed on after a little while, but I would love to hear from others because I don't claim to be the end all be all. We often talk about it in terms of learning. So we don't, we tell students, like, you probably don't have the full set of true beliefs at any given time, right? You're not sort of even consistent. And so engaging with arguments is an illuminating process, even if you don't change your mind. We used to talk a lot about persuasion, but we've sort of backed off on that a little bit. And so we like to talk about arguments as like a space for exploration and for learning, more than like just the fun of debate or something, because not everyone likes debate or trying to be persuaded or persuading, right? Not to say that it's not important, but it's maybe just not the place I would start. But I'm curious what other people say. I mean, yeah, I think we've got a bunch of philosophers in the room. I'd love to know what other people would say.
I like to focus on learning, because you can learn from people with whom you disagree if you pay some attention to what they're saying, you try to get an accurate understanding where they're coming from. So this is when I taught critical thinking classes, I would talk a bit about, you know, if someone agrees with you, that feels good and so forth, but you don't actually learn a whole lot. Whereas someone who comes at things from a different perspective and has come to different conclusions gives you an opportunity to learn, even if, as you say, you wind up ultimately being unpersuaded, but you can understand your own views better in terms of the contrast with someone with whom you disagree, if you approach that with I like Mark's suggestion of fair-mindedness. My name's Frank Fair, so got to go. Because what happens is you're treating someone else's expressions as you would wish your own to be treated,
right?
Which now connects back to charity, right? You know, and I think, by the way, I would recommend to you, if you haven't already looked at it, Sharon Balin and Mark's text in this. It's a really nice example that I think fits pretty well with the kind of approach that you all are exploring. So I'll be quiet.
No, that's wonderful.
Aidan, we have a question in the chat, and we have 2 minutes.
Okay,
So
I'll be quick.
Can you see the chat?
I can, yes. Hey Gary, how are you? Yeah, the topics I listed are totally up for debate. I mean, I think like whether they're in bounds or out of bounds. I think when we've worked with secondary institutions that have really wanted to put some bounds on the topics. Partly because they worry that introducing some of those topics might it's just hard for students to process and might feel like their identities are undermined. And so it becomes really unproductive. But it might be that, yeah, in a college context, they're just in a better position to discuss and to handle. So I think this is like almost like, that's why I was kind of like, this is just some samples. Like I think it is totally probably context dependent. Yeah, I think you're probably in a great position. I know you're in a great position to do that. Yeah.
Kevin? You're muted.
Oh, Kevin,
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Some of the issues that are cropping up in the discussion, I think kind of hinge on your definition of argument. And really, if it's using reasons to merely advocate one's beliefs, that really does devolve down to a purely rhetorical definition. If that's your goal, then yeah, it's things kind of go off the rails at that point. So you really need to get this back to critical thinking and not just rhetoric. And I think that's done by virtue of using reasons so as to, in a pursuit of truth as to what to believe, value, and do, and avoid error with respect to your beliefs, your values, and your actions. And that will help focus things on well, just what constitutes a reason, what constitutes a good reason, and maybe that might well settle some of the other issues about my word. If you think the CIA was in charge of the Twin Towers, my word, that is just so that's so off the wall, so antithetical to the pursuit of truth that it might not be worth dealing with this person. So I think by getting the definition back to that, a more critical thinking definition, that's going to help immensely. What can I say?
That's great.
Well,
Thank you
thank
so
you
much.
so much. I would like to thank
Ah.
Professor Dr. Kestigian for what I think is literally the best talk I have ever heard on intellectual empathy. And
Very good.
I will get this posted on YouTube as soon as I possibly can, and keep your eyes peeled for the third talk in the series, which will be in about a month. Okay, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.